take you on a journey and tell you a story about me, I guess, which I find hard to do, but along with the work, and they'll run parallel together. I guess one of the first things just within that context that I actually want to say is that, yeah, I'm straight from Jurassic Park, you know? I mean, this genre of photography is not sexy, especially in the contemporary world now, in the digital world, in the 21st century. I call it more a vocation instead of a profession or a job. And it's actually difficult for me to talk about it in a way because of what Ray just said. I have a lot of emotional attachment to some of the images you're going to see. And again, some of you won't like some of these images and you'll be asking questions about how could I take those pictures? And that's a legitimate question. But I want you to know now, and I've actually left most of the really dark stuff out because I've self-censored myself in a way. But I want you to know now that if you find some of my images confronting, they're not here for gratuitous reasons, and they're not here because of me. You know, it's a common dynamic now, especially with social media platforms and stuff, where photographers are constantly marketing themselves and pronouns are being used virulently, you know. It's I, and me, and stuff like that. And again, coming from Jurassic Park, one of the first things I was taught back in my early formative years on newspapers was that you don't talk about yourself as a photographer, you talk about the people who are in your pictures and the issues. And I'm still largely like that. Yeah, in a reality-biting kind of way, and this quote from Susan Linfield is about that in a way. It's about how contentious some of these images are, but how to consider... Oh, no, sorry, this is by me, this one, actually, yeah. But there's one coming up from Susan Linfield. That's not a bad quote. That's what I believe. And hers is even better. If you get a chance to read her book, as you can see, it's photography and political violence, and it explains a lot of the stuff that a lot of the public... Oh, great, there's an auto cue there like Donald Trump reads from. Look at that. Okay. I was wondering how Krista was doing that. I thought, how's she doing that? Yeah. She was so clever and so synchronized. Mind you need to be if you're going to scale, you know, rock mountains. Anyway, Susan Linfield says this, and that's the way I look at it. We have to enter into this kind of work as a conversation, as a thoughtful conversation, a mindful conversation, and take it from there, not act in a knee-jerk way when you see the images. So I'll move along a bit. And this is pretty much it. There's been times when I've had high points of elation through the work that I'm doing, and I've actually made a difference, you know. I've made a difference to a group of people or to an issue. And there's been other times where I've been emotionally wounded myself because I guess I'm just hardwired that way. You know, I've always, you know, when I was a kid, I was always told I took things too personally, I was too sensitive. And when I went and did this stuff, yeah, it took its toll. And I also realized, I was just saying to Ray, I can't help myself. I take a lot of notes. I read a lot. I've always been well read with photography along the way. And when I go to these countries, I often read as much as I can before I go. So what I'm going to do is just let some of these play in the background. I'll keep talking, and you can dip into these as you like, because there's way too many of them. But again, I wasn't always a documentary photographer, and I'm not going to tell that someone gave me a box brownie story. But basically, when I was around my early teens, my sister did give me... sorry, Kevin, I've got to mention it. It's that other camera company, Canon. She gave me a little rangefinder camera called a QL19 that the Japanese mass-produced. And I started taking pictures on it, on color neg, and I just fell in love with what you could do. And people would often say, your pictures are so different to anyone else's, you know, in the family and amongst friends. There's something about them. They have some sort of visual twist. and I really enjoyed it, but at this stage, I didn't know or think I was going to become a photographer. So again, documentary photography is not instant coffee, it takes time. On social media today, someone will just say they're a documentary photographer, but they haven't really put in the time before they make that announcement. It seems like everyone who says that they are a photographer, yeah, they are a photographer in terms of that they can take a photograph, but it was touched on earlier, and I think Crystal again mentioned this, where, you know, the difference between taking a picture and actually constructing a narrative and being a storyteller is the chasm is enormous. And that's what you learn as a documentary photographer. You learn to tell stories. And I see myself as a storyteller. Not only do I see myself as a storyteller, but a storyteller for people who are normally challenged in some way. You know, they've been born into poverty or, you know, political violence, discrimination or corruption, yeah? And somewhere within me, I got to a point where I really wanted to say something about that and do something about it, and photography was the way I was going to do it. My early years were, I started off, continuing the story about how I started, that I actually worked in advertising and commercial photography as an assistant for 4 years. I became a commercial photographer in my own right. The clients were like Chanel, Volvo Car, Beer, the Opera House, organisations, banks, Commonwealth Bank, stuff like that. But I soon found that I became, although I learnt a lot about lighting, communication, people, design, there was something tugging at me that I could never escape. And again, it was this thing that I sensed this great inequality right in the suburb that I grew up in Coogee, to Somalia, yeah? And it ate away at me, this inequality in wealth, people who had been relieved of their human rights by political dictators, corruption, discrimination, and things like that. I don't know where it came from. Not many of my friends had it. No one in my family had it. I was from a business family. No one had it. It just somewhere arrived. And I really wanted to do something about it. So I decided to get out of commercial photography. I decided to stop taking pictures like this, which were, you know, food pictures that I did a lot for Vogue Living and Vogue Cooking and stuff like that. I decided to leave all this behind. I've kind of covered that already. That's good. Let me see. So yeah, I started off not knowing and just exploring. I had no idea what I was doing. I just had this sense of injustice, things that were wrong. And I started walking the streets with my beat-up old cameras and started taking pictures around King's Cross, anywhere on the streets of Sydney, really, just doing street photography. And at the same time, there was a magazine that, with a low circulation, that was around. It was called Australian Society, and it wasn't like Australian Society, the upper echelons thereof. It was about Australian society, the lower stratum thereof. So I started documenting people like sex workers, drug addicts, homeless kids, and I had no idea what I was doing. I just felt this pull and this need to do it. And as I was doing it, I started connecting with them and talking to them and communicating with them. And I'm always interested in the why, and I was trying to find out why are these people in this situation? You know, because a lot of other people are very quick to say, well, you know, they're in the situation because there's something wrong with them, or they haven't tried hard enough, or they're lazy, whatever. There's all these things that people, in a very accusationary way, you know, point at them. And again, this is a form of discrimination. And then you find out when you actually start talking to them, no, they're not. A lot of them are on the streets or doing drugs because of some catastrophic event. I started finding this common denominator. There was one catastrophic event. You know, I mean, this is raw, but, you know, a young girl has been subjected to incest by an uncle. You know, a mother of children has been the subject of physical abuse by a husband and thrown out on the streets. And they've just never bounced back. They've never recovered. So very early on, I started connecting with these people and photographing them. This is one, was a heroin addict at the time. But for me doing this, I learnt so much. This is just near where I live. It's just street pictures, but it's, and I'm not being unkind here. I've struggled with my own weight my whole life. It's been up and down my whole life. So, but it's me. These are my formative years, my formative pictures. And actually with these people in these photographs, and this, I struggled with alcohol. I had to stop drinking because after Ray mentioned Rwanda and places like that, I started self-medicating, and basically I became an alcoholic, and I had to stop. My father was an alcoholic. So when I was taking these pictures, I'm sure, this is at Flinders Street on Taylor Square, not far from here. People would say, how could you be so voyeuristic? How could you prey on these people when they're at their lowest ebb? And they're valid questions, they're good questions, and I don't have all the right answers, and I'm not saying that I'm right. I'm just saying it's more layered and more complex than what you imagine it to be. I'm sure at this time I was being introspective about my father's alcoholism and about my own alcoholism and about other people's alcoholism. So it was they were exploratory pictures, yeah? And you've got to understand, these pictures weren't taken in isolation. I spent time with these people. I spoke to them, we connected. But mostly what they did was that they taught me. I was humbled. I'm sure that these people shaped and formed me as a photographer, and for the work that you're going to see after this. They taught me pretty much, they gave me the foundations of everything that would follow from here. She's a sex worker in King's Cross. I worked as a bartender in King's Cross. I can tell you it was pretty interesting. But one thing was that the sex workers would often come in and have a drink before they were going to do a shift, and I made friends with them over a period of time, and I would tell them that I was doing photography and I'd like to take pictures, and they would just often invite, like she invited me to come and take her picture. And she was proud, she's not standing there being ashamed. You can see she's quite strong, and she wanted me to document her. And this also answers this question where a lot of people in the public say, how could you take that picture? What were you doing there? You're a voyeur. Or especially with the conflict stuff, you're a ghoul. But actually, people invite you into their lives, and it's a privilege, but you've got to go gently and treat it with respect and responsibility. This was just another one in the infamous Porky's sex club. It's just part of the same series in this time that was formative. I mean, what I find more interesting than the girl is the men, the body language of the men and their faces, yeah? It's just I travelled around a bit around New South Wales, and it's a travelling circus in Bathurst. This is in Darwin. Again, not in Darwin, Roper River, Northern Territory. Again, I don't know. I just went up there. I went up there and I just wanted to photograph, and I just started photographing things. So very naive and didn't really know what I was doing, but all the time I went gently. I was careful. This is the block in Redfern. Doesn't look like that now. But here as well, I had to connect with the Indigenous people living here. I couldn't just roam around. So there was a dialogue going on, a conversation, and I would take photographs back to them later, and it kept going like this. These are all just pictures from bigger bodies of work, just some single pictures of my early stuff. And this is, again, I've kind of covered this, but I think the most important thing is that somehow, and this is probably, again, part of my cultural conditioning, I was raised a Catholic, and I don't practice now, but guilt is a big thing for Catholics, and I felt really guilty that people were in this situation, and I was in this, relatively privileged situation growing up in Coogee Ramwick in a middle-class family, even though there were problems, but, I didn't want for anything, and I couldn't understand how people at this end wanted for everything. And it tore away at me, Again, I don't know where it came from. And I wanted to help. There's this thing in me, and it's probably a bit like being a social worker or a therapist or a shrink, where you really want to help people. And I wanted to help, but again, clueless, had no idea how I was going to help them, but thought there was some kind of a way in photography. And that was to get becalmed even more, because after my pictures were seen in Australian Society, this magazine that later went defunct because there wasn't enough money to keep it going, I was offered a job on the local newspaper, the kind of scurrilous Daily Mirror with Murdoch. And like commercial photography, I didn't fit in there either. I was kind of the odd one. I mean, it was a very machismo environment. It was very male-led. And at that time, I was a youngish guy with hair down to my waist and looked kind of effeminate. And I guess I was more in touch with my feminine side than my male side. And even the guys who were working there, they'd call me the poofter, because I was like that, and I just didn't fit into it. I wasn't a rugby bugger, and there were page-free girls being taken in the studio. That's when they still had topless girls in the papers and all sorts of stuff. And I didn't fit. And the picture editor, in his wisdom, could see that I didn't fit with the rest of the guys, that I was the runt of the litter, I was the odd one out. And he started getting me to shoot fashion and do portraits. And in a way, that was fantastic, because that was perfect for me. And again, it was something that, skills that I could learn and build on to use in future photography. So I kept working for them, and then along came the Sydney Morning Herald. And this was a much better fit, because at that time, the Sydney Morning Herald ran pictures 6 columns across. There was a really strong ethos on the newspaper to go out and really challenge yourself and come back with a different picture. Or there's a lot of camaraderie amongst the photographers. There was less of the machismo thing. It was still there, but and they'd started hiring a few female photographers, which helped balance things out a bit. And it was just a great place to learn. And then along came the first Gulf War, and the picture at the time said, "Put it to the whole lot of us." There was a big staff then. I can't remember. The photographers were in over 20 or something, about 25 photographers. I should know, because I was working as a picture editor on the night shift sometimes. But anyway, he said, "We want a photographer to be the pool photographer to go to the first Gulf War, Desert Storm and stuff." And I was the only person who put my hand up and said, "I want to go." So they shipped me off to Western Australia, where I had to do a course in chemical warfare first, because they, again, like in Syria today, they thought that Saddam would use chemicals. And then I sailed, and I can relate to this as well. I mean, I love the sea, I love the ocean, but I sailed all the way from there on a frigate off the Gulf of Oman to Dubai, and with the Australian Navy. And from there, I was meant to go on shore and file my pictures and then come back to the ship. And I actually just ran off to Iraq. Got a car, got a driver, crossed over the border, went into Iraq and went to Baghdad. And this is my first war situation. And the reason I'm mentioning war, even though it's not documentary photography, yeah? It's not documentary photography. War or conflict photography is war or conflict photography. It's its own genre in its own right. But it was also another building block that took me into documentary photography, which we'll follow on with after that, because you got to spend a bit more time doing conflict zones. When you went to them, you normally went for a week or a couple of weeks, but in this case, I was 3 months in not very long in Baghdad, because I got thrown out, but I was in the Middle East for 3 months during this time. I wrote that one. Susie Linfield didn't write that one. And it's actually the way that I really feel. And after doing war for 10 years, I became very disenchanted with it, because I kept going back to these countries where they had a change of regime, and there was a lot of hope in the new politician, but then it would very quickly slide back into the same situation it had been in before the war took place. And normally the common denominators that you can isolate are religion, tribalism, cultural differences, and corruption. Corruption, those ones you can always find them in the recipe for why these countries are in the state that they're in. And I'd go back to a country because I would go to these countries many times. I was based in London. I was there for 10 years during the 90s, and I pretty much went back-to-back war for 10 years in conflict zones. And in the end, after being injured myself in a mortar attack, having 5 of my friends die, I suddenly saw the light and decided not to do it. But I'll show you some of the pictures. It's just a précis. With Baghdad, I got thrown out because I was in the El Sharid hotel, the main hotel in the middle of Baghdad, just before the Americans came in and bombed. And I was transmitting pictures on a machine that's a dinosaur now, but at the time it was like something James Bond called a Leafax. And a message came over the line out of the little speaker saying you are not allowed to transmit. And within 15 minutes, armed secret police were at the door. I knew that they were going to come. I shoved all my pictures in an air conditioning vent. They're probably still there. The hotel hasn't been renovated. All the damning pictures that I'd taken of Iraqi troops crossing over into Kuwait, and just kept the more kind of banal ones. Anyway, they arrested me and they put me on an empty plane and flew me to Jordan, where I covered the refugee crisis. But I basically got thrown out, so I wasn't there very long. It's my first war experience. But the second one, down here in Nagorno-Karabakh, that was a different ball game altogether. Oh, that's Baghdad. That's Iraq. Just a portrait of an AK-47, the gun that's killed more people than any other weapon known to mankind. This is an asylum in Angola, where people from young African guys had been put who were had suffered serious mental meltdowns from being combatants. There's something, this is a very simple picture, it's not a great photograph, but it still disturbs me today. I've photographed this several times in other situations where you see, it's one thing seeing an animal, it's bad enough seeing an animal chained, but when you see a human being, it just hits me at my very core. I just find it disturbing. This is it again. He's chained to an engine part. This is war trauma, but not the kind that you see gets treated in a proper clinic with people who are experts. It's basically insanity, This was in Angola too. I'll go through this quite quickly, but it's basically just a pastiche, a précis, a mosaic of different war zones I've been to, because my work is quite vast, and I just thought I'd do a bit of a kaleidoscope. But I'll stop on a couple of them. This is Angola, where these people were hiding in this building during a very brief ceasefire, yeah? And I just took one frame, and then they melted back into the darkness, and then the shooting started on the streets again. I didn't see it. War and conflict is actually much better in video. It's hard to do in stills. You don't get all that extra sensory, impact. Again, you wouldn't know that there's shooting in the streets right now, and that's why they were running. I never worked out how that Red Cross vehicle got up there like that. I had no idea. And then later on, I thought, actually, that was really dumb. Like, super dumb, because these things explode after, this is, they explode. So what I was doing there with a 28mm lens, that far away, later when I looked at the photograph, I thought, what were you thinking? This is the fatigue of war. In war too, instead of just photographing the bang-bang, it took me a while to do this because I did concentrate on the bang-bang at first, but as I went back to different war zones, I started realizing that bang-bang, as a lot of professional conflict photographers or war photographers, and I'm not one. I just had a dalliance with it, you know, just a flirt with it, really. But you start. I think the telling pictures are on the edges, you know, of like kids, women, and old men who are too old to fight. I think it's the human cost of the people, not going with the combatants. Yes, they have a cost as well, but this cost is the one that I started realizing was the one that I should be focusing on. This is just kind of daily life around different places that there's a war going on in. I mean, this was shooting outside. These babies were, you know, there was a lot of noise, there was a lot of shooting. They were terrorized by it. I often just take quiet pictures like this. I believe in the quiet photograph, you know, the picture that you've got to look into and contemplate and travel around and think about a bit. Oh, these guys were, I don't know what I was doing with these guys either. They're called the Karma Joe. They were a 3rd militia in Liberia. That's actually sharp. I'm not sure why it doesn't look that sharp. But anyway, it's a photographer thing. Out of focus pictures are okay. Some days I have out of focus days. These guys, they would wear devil masks, they'd smoke huge scoobs, and then they would go into kind of jungle warfare and battle. And they had this belief that, I think I got a portrait of him somewhere as well. There he is. They had this belief that they had supernatural powers and that mortars, RPGs, bullets, or whatever couldn't hurt them. And I can tell you for a fact, wrong. They got hurt, yeah. Again, daily life, he's an ex-war combatant. But just this moment, I don't set any of my photographs up. I was saying to Ray last night over dinner, after I left high school, and I barely scraped through on the HSC because I just wasn't interested. But anyway, and I came from a business family. I went on to do a business course, and I was at UTS, not far from here, and I was in the library doing a really exciting assignment on macroeconomics. Yeah. And anyway, someone had put a Cartier-Bresson book back on the wrong shelf. I pulled it out. I flicked through the pages. And it was simply an epiphany, you know. I just went, this is what I want to do with my life, you know. I was looking at his photographs. And therefore, yeah, I have been, even though, again, today, in the, you know, fast-paced digital tsunami image 21st century world, Cartier-Bresson would be considered passé. I was very heavily influenced by the decisive moment, and this is pretty much a decisive moment kind of photograph. I mean, actually, yeah, I took a series, and they're all single frames. I worked a lot with, sorry, Kevin, with Leica, and the series before this. But since then, I've become a Fuji acolyte. There's a series where he was asking money from the nun, but for whatever reason, she just went on. She might have had a good reason, you know. These things are complicated. Again, this is what happens in war zones. On the way to an ambush in southern Sudan. I'd say, you know, and again, not talking about myself, this stuff is really dangerous to do as well. Some of the pictures look kind of banal and ordinary, but that one in Sudan just reminded me of one time after I'd been on an assignment here in southern Sudan. I was waiting for a plane on a grass airstrip. It was just a single prop caravan in the middle of nowhere. And on the way out to the plane, this bunch of soldiers went past with cut-out wooden rifles, right? And they were doing a drill. And I just knew not to photograph them. I knew instinctively you don't photograph near military installations or training camps or something. And inside it was screaming out, take the picture, take the picture. No, don't take the picture, don't take the picture. And I didn't take the picture, and I was waiting for the plane, and the next minute these soldiers turned up and wanted to arrest me and take me back into town. And meanwhile, the pilot who had flown in to pick me up, with the prop still going, he didn't want to turn his plane off because it was a pretty dangerous area. He said, get on the plane, get on the plane. And they wouldn't let me on the plane, and they were going to arrest me. And there was this young officer, and I just said, I'm sorry, you're not arresting me, I'm not going back in the town, this is my flight out of here. And he just pulled a gun out and held it to my temple and cocked it and said, you're going back into town. I got out of that situation, but it's one of those classic things. It is a cliche, but my life just, it was slow motion, and it just went, everything swept in front of me, and I really did think he was going to pull the trigger. So even in these like quite banal things, you can end up in all sorts of problems. People were outraged that I took photographs like this. Later on, they were used in major English newspapers for Christmas appeals for raising money, and we raised over £500,000. So again, people will look at pictures like this and they'll go, "How could you do that? How could you take that photograph?" You've got to look beyond that. You've got to see the context the images were taken in. And I'm not saying there are photographers out there who are exploitative, but I don't consider myself one of them. Yeah. Think I'm not. Oh yeah, there we go. Same idea. All these pictures, even though I took them in a journalistic pursuit, this was run in Time magazine. They all had a second life, and these ones in particular rose a lot of money for these kids. This was in Angola during the Civil War. He's having his leg outside. It's a small clinic outside. There's a serious street fighting, exchange of fire going on. So that's all going in the background. Again, it's one of those things that works better on video. But he's having his leg amputated without anesthetic. This is another one of my quiet pictures. The way that he's reeling back and holding out like that in this room of pretty primitive prosthesis is simply he's having a phantom pain. People who have had their legs amputated. He was an ex-war combatant. He's having a phantom pain. And it's one of these things, when you take photographs like this, and again, it's a decisive moment, I walked in that room and I thought, there's a photograph here somewhere, and I just sat down. And I waited. I wait a lot. I've been known to wait on a corner for 6 hours because I think something's going to coalesce. In that way, I'm slightly obsessive, but and that kind of very quiet moment of him just losing his balance and opening his shirt up and then revealing this crucifix in amongst the prosthesis was just one of those situations. The only pictures I set up are portraits or if I do a still life. I will not set up my photographs. I was saying to someone last night, I feel like it's going fishing with dynamite, apart from the ethics of it, and I'm more of a fly fisherman than a dynamite fisherman. Also, this one I got into a lot of trouble when they were published in major London newspapers and they were distributed all over Europe. This is the MPLA in Angola, and they started harassing this guy. I started shooting. That AK-47 did connect with his head several times. And in the end, they shot him. They started from the feet, and then they worked their way up and shot him and left him there. And when the pictures were published, and this is before social media platforms, they were in the Observer in London, which is a really good newspaper. They said the switchboards the phones went crazy, and people were saying, how could this photographer take these pictures? Why didn't he stop the shooting? All that kind of stuff. And I don't know, all I could say was, have you ever tried to stop several men with machine guns? And you can smell them. You can smell the adrenaline coming off their bodies, And actually, when I was on the other, because I swung around the other side as well, and this is before autofocus, This is like a manual camera. And the bullets were going past my ears. And I don't know if you've ever heard the sickening sound of a high-pitched whirring bullet coming at you. It normally means you're close enough to die. So you can't really walk up to these guys and tap them on the shoulder and say, hey, could you stop shooting that guy, please, It doesn't work like that, It really doesn't work like that. And there have been other times when I've turned my back on a certain situation and walked away, but this wasn't one of them, where I thought I might have been contributing into it, or they might have been doing it for the camera or something like that. If I ever sense that, I'm out of there. No picture is worth it to me. And then the backstory was, on that last series, was that I found out later that was the MPLA because that guy wouldn't join their army. This was a message to all the other guys his age. This is what's going to happen to you if you don't sign on the dotted line and join the MPLA, the government agency for Angola army. Yeah. So the story journalistically was important. This is Somalia. I covered the famine while I was there. Waiting for a food drop in Somalia. Again, even with conflict photography, it's quite contentious, and war photography and stuff like that, you are looking for, sometimes you just do the raw hard news, but you are looking for an aesthetic that will somehow make your picture engaging to the audience, because if it's not engaging to the audience, then the communication is less, it's not as potent. The communication's not as potent. So clearly this is a way, they're waiting for a food drop, they're starving, basically. And yeah, bit of a cliche, cut through, shot through razor wire, but I think the way the kid is making the kind of binoculars with his eyes says something. This is an area that was bombed in Sudan, scorched earth policy, and this poor woman with her meager belongings walking to the next village to find somewhere to live. This is Rwanda that Ray mentioned. This was the one that finally brought me undone. Incredibly horrible apocalyptic thing, so yeah. And again, I went to this illegally, I crossed the border illegally and entered the country illegally. One of the many killing fields that we came across, there was hardly any, when this was happening, the killings were still going on, and there were hardly any journalists in the country or photographers at all, a handful, 5 at most from what we could work out later, before the world's media was let in. This is only after a few days. It was incredibly hot and humid, and the bodies would just decompose very quickly. These guys were all killers, yeah? I mean, they've been arrested and they're being held in the vestibule of a Catholic church. That's where the priest gets changed before he goes on the altar. And again, composition-wise, if you look at the eyes on the left and down here, I try to compose it, but a lot of my pictures are very emotionally laden as well, and I look for that, because again, I think emotion is really important in photography, because unless we've had an emotional lobotomy, we're all emotionally hardwired. So again, the communication can be much more potent, and you want your communication to be potent with things like this. You want people to look and think and discuss. The woman, again, a very quiet picture. If you can't work it out, it's a soldier in the front with an AK-47. He's an officer. He's interrogating them. These are the same people. They're Hutus that killed Tutsis, yeah. And the woman clasping her face like that, just at the precise second I tripped the shutter, she confessed to macheteing to death 7 people by herself. And I was just saying to Ray, there's that old chestnut, that boring old chestnut about a picture's worth 1,000 words, and he agrees. I've always said a picture is worth 1,000 misunderstandings. You need the 1,000 words to explain what's going on in a photograph. Again, I didn't set this up. It was a machine gun placement because the shells had just spilt on from whatever it is. I can't remember. I'm not very good with war toys, but big machine gun. And they just fell like that, and it was a family photograph because the Hutus went in and one of the things they did, which was really interesting to me as a photographer, is that they grabbed all the photo albums and took them out and ripped them up and threw them on the street, trying to erase every trace of these people. This is in former Yugoslavia. Again, a fairly banal, uninteresting picture, but I was in a trench with these guys, and they were shooting at the enemy coming this way, but then we got flanked from this way, and there were bullets coming in everywhere. It was nothing worse than getting flanked, metaphorically and literally. Okay. This was in Armenia, and this followed Iraq, and this guy had given me cover to get to that gun placement. It was like trench warfare, and before that, I had to negotiate. I think it was about 80 meters. Not very far, but my heart was pounding because there were a lot of incoming bullets, and then they released cluster bombs, which is like small mortars that fragment with shrapnel, and I got hit in the head and the back. Nothing serious, a lot of blood, but he kept going like this and giving me cover to get to his placement. And then when I got there, they gave me a machine gun to shoot with, and I said, no, I can't do that. Sorry, and I handed it back. Used to be an art teacher in the school in former Yugoslavia, and now was a sniper. It was a front line. The school had turned into a front line. There was a really good, the sub-editor had a great heading for that when it was in print. It was Symphony of Sorrows, which I thought was great, because he was playing Bach at the time. And I found him like that. I heard that coming down from a long corridor. If you've been to a university or institution, sometimes there's really long corridors, and I hear this beautiful music, and I thought, oh my God, earlier I was in this trench with the soldiers and got out of that, and then I found him. And then he explained to me he used to be the art teacher there. This is in Sarajevo. This is away from Sniper Alley, where life kind of went on. This little girl was still going to school. But you can see that they'd been fighting there as well. Again, it's just sort of a quiet moment, decisive moment. This was a thing that I did specifically part of a really big project on war trauma with children during the war in former Yugoslavia. I had to go back there several times, traveled all over the country, and I did a really big body of work. And this house that she lives in, her parents had been killed, and she was taking care of her siblings, and the whole outside of the house was mined. So even me walking in there was a pretty scary experience. But she's clearly traumatized, yeah. This is the graveyard in Sarajevo during the winter. That was my hotel room. That was the view from my hotel room. There was the occasional bullet. This is back to Nagorno-Karabakh, where I was in the trenches. This is the cemetery in Yerevan. This was a nice story. She, a Serb, he, a Muslim, and they got married during the war, which was pretty amazing because the Serbs were up in the hills shooting at the Muslims down on the streets. I mean, every time I walked out of my hotel room in Sarajevo, the Holiday Inn, I just didn't know I was going to get shot or not because it was like a shooting gallery, and occasionally the bullets would come in and you just run. But these two decided to get married, so even in these situations, I try and find positive things or life-affirming things as well. I just love the way he's kind of like, it's very passionate, and it's almost like he's almost lifting her off her feet. Yeah, they were very much in love. Again, part of my war trauma series. Again, none of these pictures are set up. This was a heartbreaking story. In Tuzla, which is north of Sarajevo, the fighting was pretty fierce up there, and there was bombing, and they were out playing soccer. He ran on the field to try and rescue one of his little pals who had been hit, and then a mortar came in and tore his eyes out and blinded him. And then when I was in the hospital photographing him, I took that photograph first. It was an assignment. I took the photograph first. And then the surgeon came along, and this is where it all gets bigger than you. And the doctor came along and ripped the bandages off his eyes, and he had horrific wounds, yeah? And his name's Siad Barik, and the doctor ripped it off and, quote, unquote, said to me, photograph this and show the world what these bastards have done. And it's too much responsibility. You can't guarantee that. But I think it's really important to document these things, because of a historical perspective, a political perspective for the record and things like that, But this doctor was just so incensed, and he just ripped the bandages off. I mean, I didn't even want to take the picture, but he kind of stood over me and demanded, that I should really shoot it. So I shot it quite wide, so it wouldn't be as graphic. We've had her. Israel, that's his sister in the photograph. She was killed by the Israeli army. I was also thrown out of as Israel as well because I hopped in the boot of a car and crossed into Gaza Strip illegally. And I was documenting life there. The Israeli army caught me, intimidated me. It was filmed then. They ripped all the film out of my cameras, or most of it. and then they sent the rest of it to Tel Aviv. And they took me to Jerusalem, took me to the airport, and at the airport they held up the slide folders where they cut out all the incriminating pictures, especially the picture where they shot a young boy in the back running down an alleyway. So, yeah. This is in Thailand, where I lived for quite a long time. Thailand as well, 2006, political conflict. Yeah. People died in this. Thailand. Where was that? Tajikistan. Yeah, Tajikistan. This guy got shot next to me when we were out on the streets. Head wound. But again, instead of doing something graphic, I went for the moment, just the moment where his eyes were open and they closed them. So I just tried to, make it a more sensitive image. Plato's attributed to that, but there's great contention about whether he really said it or not, but I'll go with Plato for now. Yeah, and I think Ray kind of very eloquently explained this. A lot of people who do this work considered to be adrenaline-fueled junkies. I think you experience a certain amount of adrenaline, but for me personally, it kind of kept me clear-headed and thinking, because basically I was really scared all the time. I'm a coward, I'm going to tell you. It's scary stuff. It's really scary stuff. And this line's probably really important for me. When I was doing this work and before I stopped it, and I stopped it in the end because I had 5 friends who were either really badly injured or had actually been killed doing this work. And it coincided with the birth of my first boy, who's now at film school in Cape Town, of all places. And I thought, you've got to stop this work. So I stopped. But at that time, nothing seemed more important to me than documenting the plight of people caught up in it, yeah? Yeah, I've mentioned that. I just put these up because I'm anally retentive. There's too much there, yeah? Okay. Yeah, well, this is kind of the last paragraph. Not only did I shift my focus from the front lines to ordinary people on the edges of war, I shifted my focus in general, documenting people affected by a cross-section of contemporary social issues. So this kind of led me into documentary photography, yeah? That's where I'm going with this in a rather long-winded way. And before we go into my first documentary projects, and I'll explain what documentary photography is, because that's mostly photojournalism or conflict, or war photography specifically, if you want to define it, is all these following photographs. I've done quite a lot of documentary projects, and basically, when I talk about documentary projects, it's normally something that, there's no exact time that you spend on it, but you'd spend a longer time than you do in a photojournalistic pursuit. And I think the longest time I spent was 6 years on the Thai-Burma border, which I'll show you. And it was all about immigration and, people with no status or people who've been relieved of their human rights or have been exploited. I spent 6 years on that. But I also spent 10 years off and on another project called Positive Lives, which was to do with AIDS and HIV. And documentary projects you spend a lot of time on, but the war stuff kind of led me into that stuff, I think, yeah? And these are other documentary projects that I spent probably not 10 years or 6 years on, but, randomly a year to a couple of years or whatever, yeah? So I'll show you. P&G, the Rascals, yeah? The Amish in upstate New York. Glenn was asking to talk about, something that went wrong with photographs. I have to tell you the truth. I manipulated this picture. Not the composition. It was originally shot on Kodachrome, but the lens, talking about aperture, excuse the pun, the aperture broke on the lens that I was using and stayed wide open. So I was on an assignment for a magazine and nearly every picture was grossly overexposed. So later we took the Kodachrome, which is this beautiful color, and we did internegs and made them into black and white. But the image is real. These kids are coming, they're the Amish, they're coming back from church on a Saturday morning, and just like notes on a sheet of music, they just fell into line like that. They're all brothers. I mean, it's almost a cliche, but what's kind of remarkable for me about it is that, it really did happen. I mean, it's bizarre because it only lasts a split second. The frame before and the frame after are completely messy. Yeah. This is another one I did on mercury poisoning in Sulawesi, high in the mountains. They were using mercury to separate gold from ore, and it was going down into the river system, into the bay, into Manado Bay. And it's causing serious health problems because the mercury was going to the fish, and people were eating the fish and getting sick because mercury is the most dangerous element known to mankind. And of course, women were having enormous problems with pregnancies and losing babies and stuff. And I did that for a German magazine called Mare, which is, I think Mare is the Latin word, not for sea, but just water. Yeah. This was the thing I did on gypsy culture in Ireland. I love doing this. This was real, again, just on the street, these two gypsy kids. Boys don't do that now, they play with their iPhones. This is I did a daily life thing in Monrovia in Liberia during the war. This is an asylum. I covered the tsunami, and this was a 5-year anniversary. I went back to Aceh, and this was an asylum from people who never bounced back from the tsunami. So photographers and journalists do go back sometimes. I mean, I used to go back all the time. This is in PNG again. This is about coal mining. Climate control, global warming, things like that. And these guys are covered in a fine black ash after they come back up from the coal mine. And these big burly guys, this is the only way that they can get the ash off them. They go into the shower block and they all wash each other down. So it's again, part of a big body of work. Went down under the earth, and they're still using horses, donkeys and stuff to pull the coal out. But kind of an unusual photograph, I think. I did a thing in Louisiana. This one was about 6 weeks long before I got chased out of town by some white Confederate types, extremists, where I went into the black area and I just photographed daily life for that time. It was really hard for me to get access. But when I got in, they really let me in. She was a sex worker. She let me in even when she was servicing clients and stuff like this, and that's what's happening here. So I had this amazing access, but again, it bears a responsibility. There were photographs after this. I've never published them. I don't show them. I go for the one that's got the tension in it before. I'm careful, He was okay with it. I asked him about being identified. Soweto, spent a lot of time in Soweto. About the illegal counterfeit drugs in Cambodia, and where else? Laos, yeah. A lot of illegal drugs being sold there. Poverty in the Philippines. People live in the cemetery and they become caretakers of these rich people's graves, Catholic cemetery. She's on the way to school. Russians with their newfound wealth going down the Volga River. This was another part. I decided not to show you this. Out of all my 10 years on and off of photographing HIV and AIDS, which, by the way, I did for a trust in London, and it wasn't editorial, it wasn't for a magazine. This was all about education and attacking discrimination against people who had HIV and AIDS and were living with it. This is in a diabolically horrible hospice in Thailand, about 3 hours out of Bangkok. This place was a nightmare. But again, I tried to take the pictures, give people dignity or anonymity or both. This is Ponsavan in Laos, the most bombed place on planet Earth during the Vietnam War. Oh, just my barber. I like barber shops. I've got a whole thing of barber shops. Yeah. It's about Catholicism. It's in Spain, the Easter Festival. It's the same town as the sex worker, Lake Providence it was called. It was statistically the most poorest town as assessed by economists in America when I did the project. The Nuba, who was, some of you might know about the Nuba, an incredible race of people who live in the Nuba Mountains, which is now in southern Sudan since they divided it up, but near northern Sudan. And they live high in the mountains. Leni Riefenstahl, Hitler's very famous publicist, who photographed the Nuremberg rallies and what's that other really famous one? I can't remember. Yeah, I'm jet lagged. She photographed these people. She was very famous. Actually, she wrote to me after I'd photographed them and wanted me to come and visit her in Germany and show her my work. It was a big body work. I did 2 trips. It almost killed me. It involved long trekking, malaria. I got malaria and dysentery and almost died up there, and spent a lot of time with them. Again, this was the tsunami in Thailand. It was pretty grim after the tsunami in Thailand, and I tried to find another way. I did a whole series of still lifes of people's left possessions who'd perished in the tsunami on the beach resorts in Thailand. And the picture editor on the New Yorker said she thought it was the most, kind of oblique or interesting take on that. So again, it's, even Jurassic documentary photographers like me can come up with a different idea from time to time. This is part of my latest project. I'm shooting a lot of stuff on a Fuji X-Pan panorama film camera. So I just put 1 or 2 in. It's already a fairly big body of work, but I just put 1 or 2 in. Spent a lot of time with the Australian shearers. I went on the road with the Australian shearers, which was an education. did great wonders for my liver at the time. Called the longest paddock, in case you didn't know. This is when there's a drought and they put the sheep on either side of the road because there's nothing for them to eat inside the fence, yeah? So out there they call it the longest paddock. Just another traveling circus. I was 5 feet or 6 feet away when I took this picture because I remember looking, again, manual focus, looking in the lens, and I could not work out how he was doing that. It was incredible. Again, part of Monado, a landscape. This bay is full of mercury or has high mercury levels. And that's the stills. All right. Okay. How much time have I got? Am I going too slow? I've only got 5 minutes. Jesus Christ, I can talk. Yeah. Oh, okay. All right. I'll get on with it. All right. I'll just encapsulate and I'll run through the pictures quietly. We can get through the pictures in 5 minutes. I'll just let them flow over you, yeah? But I guess here the main difference I wanted to cite was between documentary photography and photojournalism. Photojournalism is, sometimes people think photojournalism is documentary photography, or it's a synonym for documentary photography, but it's not. Photojournalism is a time-driven thing, pretty much by the 24-hour clock of unfolding news events most of the time. Documentary photography is more this like immersive thing and in its best state, a collaborative thing where, especially with the HIV work I did and things like that, you say to people, how do you want to be seen? And they take part in the process and the editing and everything, yeah? So the balance between, the power balance between, which a photographer can have a lot of in these situations, and I never call them the subject, I call them the participant, is equaled out. And that was going to be my main message in a nutshell. But I'll run through 3 documentary projects that I've done. One of the AIDS or HIV one was taken here in Australia because people always say people like me can't photograph in their own country, and why don't they? And I do. And the second one is about these beautiful sailing boats, or it might be a third one, I don't know, I have to look, called dhows. And historically, they're really important because they were the boats that sailed to the east coast of Africa, and they actually introduced Islam to the east coast of Africa, and then those boats sailed back on the trade winds, which would turn around every 6 months. and they took back slaves to the Middle East and then on to America, yeah? So they're really important. What was my other one? I can't remember. Anyway, I'll get on with it. I'll show you the pictures. That's my main message anyway. I was going to, this is Andrew. This is the first age story. Also really unique at the time because unlike most people who get AIDS, he actually had it in the brain. And no one knew about that at the time. And he got it through a bad blood transfusion here in Australia. I got really close with him, yeah? I spent over a year with him before he died. This is really hard. You know, he's dying here. I kept photographing while he was dying. I mean, I actually didn't want to, but they told me to keep doing it. I'd had enough, and it was too confronting, but these are his last, the last breaths that he took. This is his funeral. It's his girlfriend on the left, the tallish one with the blonde hair, and his mum, school teacher, Carol. Okay, well, this is the border project. I'll just go through. This is very similar to the Rohingya thing, yeah? Just in another part of Thailand. Try and look for, you can see a narrative. The first picture is actually the border between Thailand and Burma. You can see a narrative in here, like a writing narrative with an introduction, body, and conclusion. If you look for it, you'll see it, yeah? These kids are just all on the other side of that bridge that you saw in the opening picture. These kids are taking drugs across to Thailand, the swimmers. It's about poverty. This kid's been orphaned. Sex workers, more poverty. Me trying to, how do you photograph a border? I'm in a hotel room in Thailand and out the window is Burma across a small river. Raincoat, going into Thailand illegally. Sex worker who I spent a lot of time with and became friends with. Tribal people who had been put into a human zoo, colloquially known as the longnecks, but culturally known as the Kayan people. The only time the Thais and the Burmese got together, cockfighting. No, I don't agree with cockfighting. I don't agree with it, but it's interesting. Malaria, rice harvest. These people are exploited by the Thais, cheap labor. Rice husks raining down. A Buddhist monastery for young orphan kids from Burma. A Thai monk was taking care of them. Just rode the horses into the river and washed them and then fell asleep on them. That's him. He was taking care of them. Deeply unpopular. Ex-Thai military, taking care of Thai kids, Burmese kids. Meditation. He was really doing that. Didn't interfere with that at all. Pegasus tattooed on his chest. Drug searching on the border. Too young to go to war. KNLA rebel group. Amputation again, this time with a local anesthetic and a blunt saw. I love this quote by this author and writer, American author and writer. Read that, just even if I'm running out of time, just read that quickly. It's worth reading. All right, okay. Sorry, too fast? My remains, read it later, it's an amazing quote, amazing writer. Landmines, Burmese military make these guys walk forward when they're going into the jungle, so they walk on the mine first. Crossing illegally. Again, they're all moment pictures, but I try and get an aesthetic in it. You've got to try and keep your pictures interesting. A lot of people think that this kind of photography is hackney now, and it's probably traditional documentary photography, but probably my last point I'll make is that, I've never, people used to say to me earlier, you've got to have your own style, you've got to have your own look, it's got to be unique, you've got to be questing for this, do all your pictures on an angle or something so you're seasick, and that's going to be your signature. My style is life. You know, my style is what unfolds in front of me and the way that I compose it and the original moment, you know, a bit like the original sin, the original moment. I don't want to create a style or a unique look. You know, this is compelling enough to me already. Yeah. But I am told now it's quite hackney and you know, we've seen it all before. But I think people don't get the zen of photography, you know. If you say you've seen this all before, you're looking at the style and you're not looking at the content and the original moment. New house, just past that jungle is Thailand, and across the river, they're heading to Thailand. She's just building a house before she, you know, the authorities wouldn't let her go any further. All right, and I'll just go through, this is the DAOs, I won't talk. I'm shutting up now, all right? That's the last one. Thank you.